Right. Right. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining for today's webinar, Breast Cancer Actions webinar, Toxic Still Not Tasty, Oil, Wastewater, and Your Food. We're really grateful to have you here today. My name is Kate Fisher, and I'm the campaigns coordinator here at Breast Cancer Action, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. So we're very excited to have acclaimed ecologist Dr. Sandra Steingraber on to speak today, as well as our executive director here at Breast Cancer Action, Karuna Jaggar. So first, some housekeeping. At any time during the webinar, you will be able to ask questions by typing it into the question bar on the right-hand side of your screen, and we're going to make sure to save some time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. You have probably noticed by now that everyone except for the presenters will be muted during the webinar, and we do this just to cut down on background noise so that everyone can hear. So finally, before we jump in, we want you to know that Breast Cancer Action doesn't take any money from corporations that profit from or contribute to the breast cancer epidemic, which means our work is largely supported by individual donors like you. So if you, at the end of today's webinar, feel like donating or feel like this webinar has been beneficial to your learning and education, please consider making a $25 donation to support our work like this. So for today's agenda, I'm going to start by providing a very brief overview of Breast Cancer Action, who we are, what we do, and then we're really going to jump into the bulk of the webinar presentations. So like I mentioned, we're very excited to have Dr. Sandra Steingraber, an acclaimed ecologist and anti-fracking activist, who has written extensively about the impact of environmental harms on human health and human rights with a focus on chemical contamination. Dr. Steingraber will be providing some context setting about what oil wastewater is and how it's currently being used in agriculture before discussing some of the specific chemicals of concerns and their related health risks. Afterwards, our executive director, Karuna Jaggar, will explain how this issue relates to breast cancer before delving into some actions you can take to protect our food and our health. We'll also have David Braun with Rootskeeper to discuss one of those actions and activist training briefly before we open it up for questions. To reiterate what I mentioned before, you can feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar by writing into the chat box on the bottom right corner of your screen. So who is Breast Cancer Action? We are an organization that was founded in 1990 by a group of women living with breast cancer who were really frustrated with the lack of information about breast cancer and saw a need for community. Inspired by other movements like the AIDS activist movement and ACT UP, they founded Breast Cancer Action because they saw a need for a grassroots organization with a unique understanding of the political, economic, and social context of breast cancer. Our founders, only one of whom is still alive today, knew that their private medical crises were part of a larger public health emergency, and the experiences of those dealing with breast cancer needed to be heard to address this crisis. So Breast Cancer Action is the only organization that addresses the breast cancer epidemic from an intersectional approach, looking at the intersections of breast cancer, the environment, social justice, and feminism. Our mission is to achieve health justice for all women at risk and living with breast cancer. So some of the core values that guide our work you can see listed here. We believe that health justice is a human right. We believe in honesty, fearlessness, and truth-telling about the breast cancer epidemic, and honoring women's diverse voices and lived experiences. We believe in putting people's health and well-being over corporate profits, and we believe in transparency and accountability for ourselves and others. We also believe that collective action can change the world for the better. And finally, we have integrity and freedom from conflict of interest. At Breast Cancer Action, it's important for us to recognize how issues of health and social justice are intertwined through the work that we do and form a foundation for our core values that I just went through in order to end the breast cancer epidemic. So that's why we made social justice a foundation for all of our work, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means to us as an organization. So for us, our commitment to social justice is seen in 4 main areas. The first is that we know the breast cancer epidemic impacts communities unequally and leads to unacceptable differences in who develops breast cancer, when it develops, and who gets high quality and timely treatment, as well as who dies from breast cancer. We also know, and this is where today's webinar comes in, that in order to address and end the epidemic, we must tackle the root causes of health inequities, which are often the result of a complex interplay of things like culture, power, economics, racism, and sexism. We also believe that no single injustice can be effectively addressed in isolation, and we recognize that all of these injustices in our society reinforce each other in many ways and at many levels. And last but not least, in our work for health justice, we strive to be an ally by using the power and privilege we hold as an organization to build solidarity with communities who currently or traditionally have had less access to power, information, and resources. So I will go through our strategic priorities fairly quickly. You've just gotten a lot about the values underlying what we do. But as the watchdog for the breast cancer movement, we educate, organize, and take action for systemic change in 3 distinct areas. So the first that you can see up here is our work on breast cancer screening, diagnosis, and treatment, which largely works on examining the data from a patient perspective and includes breast cancer screening, healthcare access, drug and device approval, and demands more effective, less costly, and less toxic treatments. The next, again, which is where this webinar today plays in, is our work around the root causes of the breast cancer epidemic. So this focuses on eliminating involuntary exposures to hazardous and toxic chemicals present in all of our daily lives that put us at increased risk of breast cancer. And the last is pink ribbon marketing and culture, which often exploits a disease that devastates communities, misrepresents who is affected by breast cancer, and excludes and marginalizes women's diverse lived experiences of the disease. So we address the true impact that breast cancer has on women's lives and their communities. You might have noticed that the title for today's webinar was Toxic Still Not Tasty. And this actually relates to this last point around pink ribbon marketing and culture. Each October, when Breast Cancer Awareness Month takes place, or as we call it, Breast Cancer Industry Month, we run what's known as our Think Before You Pink campaign. And last year's Think Before You Pink campaign was called Toxic Isn't Tasty to address the use of pink ribbon marketing and culture by 2 specific citrus companies who are involved in the process of using agricultural oil wastewater. So we'll be sharing more about that. I'm sure Karuna will talk about it later. But you can see the interplay among all of these. Before I hand it over to Sandra, I just want to talk a little bit about, why are we talking about this today? Breast Cancer Action is based in San Francisco, although we are a nationwide organization. A lot of the research and evidence that we have does come from our own state, but it's important because even if these practices are specifically in California, they have nationwide impacts. So for example, California grows over 1/3 of the nation's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruit and nuts, and it's also the 3rd largest oil producing state in the country. So no matter where you live in the US, I want you to remember today, as you hear this really important information, if you eat fruits and vegetables, you're no doubt eating some food that's been grown in California. So when it comes to our food, air, and water, there are no boundaries that mean we can ignore this issue. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Sandra Steingraber.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to Breast Cancer Action for inviting me here. BCA is one of the organizations I admire most in this world. I love that they have this idea of truth-telling in their very mission statement, truth-telling about the breast cancer epidemic. And of course, a lot of that truth is scientific truth. So I came here to share a little science with you on this topic of agricultural waste and food production in California, and what its intersections are with breast cancer. And if I do my job right, that connection should seem obvious by the end of the hour, rather than a kind of a stretch. So let me begin by pointing out that Central California is a region that has two split economic identities. One economic identity of the Central Valley of California occurs on its sunlit surface, which is where we grow the nation's food crops. The other takes place underneath the surface, away from the sunlight, in the dark geological formation and the bedrock itself that undergirds Central California, which is full of oil. There's an oil basin that lies underneath the Central Valley of California, and we're talking about areas now like Kern County and the larger San Joaquin Valley. So what that means is that in this same place, we're a top producer of the nation's food crops, and we also have the highest density of drilling and fracking operations in the state. So you see drill rigs next to orchards, right? And where these two different economic identities come together is through the medium of water. So water is where California's two identities meet, and that's because the groundwater itself occurs in the same geological depth as where the oil basins are. So oil in California happens to be located in a pretty shallow strata, unlike other places where I'm from in the Northeast. The fossil fuels are actually held about a mile below our feet, but not so here in California. It's fairly shallow, so your drinking water aquifers and the oil are not so far removed from each other in depth. The other thing to know about California's oil is that it's especially watery when it comes out of the ground. So for every gallon of oil that comes up, there are between 10 and 19 gallons of water mixed in with that oil. As one of our most esteemed environmental leaders, Cha Smith, has pointed out about California's oil, it's a little like maple syrup. You have to boil so much water off to get the oil. And so the watery nature of California's oil is just part of its personality. Every oil basin in North America has kind of a different signature. So we know that the oil, for example, that's pulled out of the Bakken Shale up in North Dakota is particularly full of benzene and other lightweight hydrocarbons that make that oil particularly explosive. But what California's oil is known for is being full of water. So that means when the oil is pulled up out of the ground by drilling operations, the water, the so-called oil wastewater, has to be separated away from the oil before anything else can happen. That wastewater is not just pure drinkable water. It has within it all kinds of toxics, heavy metals, brine and other salts, and then these volatile organic compounds, including things like benzene, which is not only a known carcinogen, but is a known breast carcinogen. And so by now, I think you see why an organization that, like Breast Cancer Action, that so uncorruptibly and so unconflictedly advocates for women with cancer and works to prevent breast cancer, must take on this issue of oil wastewater here in California, because it's a vehicle for introducing into our food supply and into our communities chemicals that are known to be linked to breast cancer. In addition to the naturally occurring toxic chemicals that are carried up to the surface through the oil wastewater, this wastewater also very often contains chemicals that are deliberately added in order to get the oil flowing up the pipe. And whether that takes place by fracking or whether that takes place through normal drilling operations, we know that a lot of chemicals are added to enhance the ability to get the oil to flow up the pipe and out the top. a new study has shown us that those chemicals, there are about 173 different chemicals that are actually deliberately added. Those are used not just in so-called enhanced drilling operations like fracking, but also to clean out pipes and to do sort of routine operations. So this is a much bigger problem than fracking alone. So you've probably heard that drilling and fracking operations raise health risks, and particularly cancer risks, for people who live near them. There's a brand new study out now showing that 17 million people in the United States live within a mile of a drilling and fracking operation, and that number includes actually 1.4 million children less than 5 years old. And so a lot of my work and the work of my colleagues in public health investigate health risks to people who live in close proximity to where drilling and fracking goes on. But what the issue of irrigation with oil waste is showing us is that this is not just an issue of proximity and locality, right? Because because all of us across the United States eat the salad bowl and the fruit bowl and the nut bowl that is Central California. So essentially we are projecting risks onto geographically different populations by having oil drilling take place in the same location that we're growing food crops in Central California. And that actually happens in two different pathways. So one is the practice of using wastewater as irrigation fluid to grow crops. So we're actually piping wastewater into the orchards, and growers are actually paying for it. And we're going to talk about that in some detail. But I want to mention the second route, which is inextricably linked to the first, which is that wastewater is also injected deep under the ground. So let me start over and say that when we bring this oily, watery oil out of the ground and we separate the crude oil from the water, the wastewater, one of two things can happen. We can put that wastewater in a pipe and pipe it into the orchards and have it used for irrigation fluid, or more commonly, it's put into a pipe and injected back under the ground. And by doing that, we risk contaminating the groundwater aquifers that we not only use for drinking, but we also take back out of the ground to use to irrigate the crops, right? So there are two pathways by which oil wastewater can reach our food crops. One is by the practice of deliberately piping it in and calling it irrigation fluid. But the other is to pipe it back down under the ground and inject it into drinking water aquifers, and then draw that back out of the ground again and use that to irrigate crops. So there's these two pathways, and they are interconnected. And I want to point that out because shutting down one can inadvertently increase the risks of the other. And here's how it works. Up until this past year, there was an ongoing, very serious drought in California. And there were also a kind of lack of disposal options for fracking fluid. And as we discovered, the careless practice of injecting fracking waste into the few remaining drinking water aquifers in California, and some of this was done, this information was learned through an investigative report by KQED. So I want to give them credit for this. So California regulators, who are charged with protecting groundwater from fracking waste, discovered that for years they failed to do so. The EPA had a list of all the aquifers that were supposed to be protected, but it wasn't being used by the California regulators, and they actually inadvertently, through miscommunication and bad data, allowed oil operators to actually inject wastewater directly into aquifers that have drinkable water in it. And this practice happened before we even could measure the naturally occurring chemicals in those aquifers. So we don't even know, we don't have any baseline to know how contaminated they now are. But when that was discovered, we closed 56 of those disposal wells. 11 of them were actually closed in Kern County alone. But in spite of the fact that these wells were closed, hundreds of other injection wells still are in operation and continue to this day in places like Kern County and in places where we grow food crops. So the pressure to stop injecting wastewater into our drinking water aquifers here in California, which is a stunningly reckless practice, increased the pressure, the political pressure to actually recycle this so-called ag waste and use it for irrigation and use it for livestock watering, right? And so we know, for example, in the year 2015, that Chevron piped 20 million gallons of oil wastewater to be used as irrigation. And tests have shown the presence of volatile organic chemicals. Acetone is one, benzene is another, methylene chloride is the third. These are chemicals known to be linked to cancer, but also to kidney, liver, and nerve damage. So in the year 2016, last year, the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, University of California, Berkeley, and the University of the Pacific did some study that was an outgrowth of research requested by the Senate Bill 4 in 2013 on the risks of fracking. So that bill mandated that we learn a lot more about what these risks were, and out of that came a study last year. Was the first ever hazard assessment that looked at chemicals that are used in oil drilling operations. So these are the deliberate chemicals that are added in order to get the oil flowing out of the ground. And what they discovered was that there are 173 chemicals. 1/3 of these are considered to be protected under trade secrets, so they have unknown identification. And of the remainder, 10 of them were cancer-causing chemicals, 22 were toxic air contaminants. But the conclusion then, and I'm quoting here, is that it is difficult or impossible to estimate risks to consumers or farm workers when identification of chemical additives remains trade secret. And then, of course, the second unknown here is the so-called bioabsorption quotient. So even if we did know all the chemicals that were reaching the roots of all of our food crops, how do we know they're actually absorbed through the roots and make it into, let's say, the sap of your tangerine? Citrus is 90% water. We ourselves as human beings are 65% water. So as the xylem and the phloem are carrying sap up and down between the roots and the fruits, some of those chemicals are moving, but we don't have a lot of good data knowing if they actually find their way into the fruit, and then or find our way into our own blood plasma. But because of all those unknowns, and because precaution, of course, is supposed to dictate public health, the California Council on Science and Technology 2 years ago already recommended banning the use of oil wastewater to irrigate crops. And yet, in spite of that recommendation, California has not yet acted on that recommendation, nor has acted on other recommendations of that panel, I should add, which also recommended, for example, buffer zones for people. There should be some kind of minimal distance for where children live and where oil drilling operations take place. Those recommendations are not being followed either. So in other words, California is encouraging scientists to do these studies and fill in missing information, but so far isn't acting on the recommendations of the scientists. And we have some idea why. The oil industry has spent $122 million in the last 6 years lobbying representatives, elected officials, legislators, the governor, and the result has been that the science sits on the shelf, recommendations are not acted on, and more science isn't forthcoming. So that's a problem. Under those kinds of situations, science can't move. And that's why it's even more crucial that we support groups like Breast Cancer Action, I would say, that's not taking money from industries that are pulling strings and have the ability to hush science and prevent recommendations of scientists from being enacted. So let me now look at the unintentional use of fracking waste, which is problem number 2, right? So if we did succeed in banning fracking waste going to be used as a deliberate source of irrigation for our crops, we still have another problem, which is that by closing off that route of disposal, we increase all this 19 gallons of water for every gallon of oil that comes out of the ground. It has to go somewhere. It's a massive amount of contaminated water that has to go somewhere. So the other thing we do with it here in California is to inject it back under the ground in a pipe, in a so-called irrigation, a so-called injection well. And because some of those injection sites are right next to aquifers, or right directly into aquifers, we can contaminate groundwater with oil wastewater, and then use that water to irrigate crops. We know that in some cases, even when you dispose of the wastewater far down beneath where the drinking water aquifers are located, because there are all kinds of old oil wells that serve as chimneys between those deep layers where injection takes place and the aquifers, that you can wick up wastewater into drinking water. And some of the new research shows this. There's actually a farmer that documented a lot of this, is now suing the oil companies because of it. And we're asking questions about whether this wastewater has killed cherry and almond trees in the Central Valley, and whether or not these chemicals are contaminating the fruits that come from those orchards. Again, we're still injecting waste into protected aquifers in Kern and Tulare County. California is supposed to review by February last year these practices. Last I looked, that still hasn't happened. That review still hasn't happened. Thus, we still don't know how much oil waste in California is going into the drinking water aquifers here. KQED, again, did some of this investigation. They actually asked California regulators for the records showing contamination levels in the wastewater. The response they got was, we can't produce these records. They're scattered in various regional offices, and also the Division of Oil and Gas is not looking at that. Further, the state doesn't require chemical disclosure of stuff like that. So that means we don't know what to test for, and there's no timeline for testing it. So to conclude here, the power of the oil and gas industry here in New York has blinded the ability of science to ask questions that women with cancer want answers to. Remember in that 2016 study, we learned that 173 chemical additives were used in oil fields. Presumably it's in the wastewater, but we don't have the science to show us what happens after that. There was a study done, the Coahuila Irrigation District in Central California did what's called the Coahuila study that looked, Coahuila is a place where wastewater was purchased by growers for use in irrigation. Citrus was tested for 9 chemicals, but remember that there are about 173 chemicals that are additive, and so it was a very limited study, and without full disclosure of what the chemicals are, without appropriate testing protocols, we just don't have answers. So I'm very pleased that Protect California Food, a coalition of different groups, are working together to halt the practice of irrigation. From my way of thinking, this campaign is important, but needs to be coupled with an attempt to stop injecting into groundwater aquifers as well. I don't see a way that you can take oil out of the ground in California without generating vast amounts of wastewater that have to go somewhere, which leads me to believe that the science that we have available to us now, that we have to act on, is showing us that, again, for many reasons, we need to leave these fossil fuels in the ground and move as quickly as possible to renewable energy here in California. There's no way to take a bunch of carcinogenic wastewater and store it safely somewhere here in California. So I'm going to show you 3 slides here, and and then I'll be delighted to answer your questions. Here is our compendium on the risks and harms of fracking that I put together as one author of many. My co-authors are scientists who work in public health and members of the medical community. We have created a compendium on risks and harms of fracking that includes some of what we've talked about today, the use of oil waste going into and how it's impacting agriculture here in California. So this is a fully referenced peer-reviewed study, and it's available at concernedhealthny.com. Here's the first page of it for you. So this is science translated into, I hope, some plain-spoken English. But for a sort of sexier presentation, here is a fact sheet put out by Rootskeeper, another organization I admire greatly. Rootskeeper works together with Breast Cancer Action in the California Against Fracking Coalition. So Rootskeeper has investigated where the oil industry lobbying money goes and the impact that it's had on silencing some of the science that we've talked about, and through their magic of graphic design and laying things out visually. Here's a one-pager on the issue, and this is available to you at oilmoneyout.com, oilmoneyout.com. And then lastly, I want to end with this photo. This is the reason I'm here, actually, in San Francisco, joining you. This is my dear friend and mentor in all this, Judy Brady, who died in May. And her memorial service is actually on Sunday, August 27th at noon at the Women's Community Building, and I'll be speaking about her. And if it weren't for Judy, I think I would just be a biology teacher in the Midwest somewhere. It was Judy working with groups like Breast Cancer Action. She was a columnist for the newsletter for many years, who helped me redirect my own research interest along these intersectional lines of public health and the environment and justice. Judy, when she died, asked her daughters have asked donations to be made in her name to Breast Cancer Action, and as one of the places she wanted her memory to live on. So thank you, Judy, for helping us all find our voices and speak in a truth-telling way about the breast cancer epidemic. Now I'm really delighted to answer your questions.
This is Karuna. You can see that I did get out into foggy San Francisco and peer through the clouds in my eclipse glasses on Monday. It was nothing like an amazing celestial event to help us appreciate the value of this planet and the importance of our work on it and to protect it. I just want to really thank you, Sandra, for being with us, but also for your incredible leadership and work to protect public health and to protect the climate. You know, I'm often asked why a breast cancer organization is engaged in what a lot of people sometimes see as essentially climate work. You know, they may not see the connection at first, and you've done a really powerful job of telling the story of why we do this work. I'm also, you know, I think the truth is that we're facing a lot of threats right now. You know, there's so many threats to civil liberties, to democracy, to basic human rights, to health. And I think, you know, sometimes people ask, well, you know, isn't that sort of taken care, isn't breast cancer taken care of? I mean, after all, we're all aware, and you have the pink ribbon. And so I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about our approach and really what is going on with the breast cancer It's not enough to tell women they should be aware of breast cancer. We are all aware. What we need is real action to address the root causes of this public health crisis, and we need action to address the fact that certain communities are more likely to die of breast cancer and bear a disproportionate burden of disease. And thinking about the scope of breast cancer, I do want to take a minute to walk us through the stats and really absorb what it means that despite all the pink ribbons and the billions of dollars spent on breast cancer, each and every year, more than 250,000 women are diagnosed with breast cancer. Another 63,000 women are diagnosed with non-invasive DCIS, but nonetheless are treated for breast cancer. And anybody who has been through or supported a loved one through treatment knows what that means. And still, 40,000 women die each and every year of the disease. You can click over. Between 2002 and 2011, breast cancer rates were stable for non-Hispanic white women, but during the same period, they continued to increase for Black women. And we know that there's an unequal burden of breast cancer. So the Black and Latino women are significantly more likely to die of their disease than white women. And we know that these higher death rates cannot be explained by less screening. And while there's limited evidence about some other underserved communities, for example, trans people with breast cancer, the complex interplay of economics and power and racism and discrimination that are a bedrock of our country have led to and do lead to a variety of social injustices, and in particular to health disparities and worse outcomes related to breast cancer for certain groups. And so I want to really recognize why it is that the pink ribbons have not, or the fact that pink ribbons have not solved the breast cancer epidemic. You can advance to the next slide. Few people realize that the chance that a woman will be diagnosed with breast cancer at some point in her lifetime has risen steadily over the last 50 years, from 1 in 20 in the 1960s to 1 in 8 today. And as the incidence of breast cancer has risen, so too has the incidence of other cancers, thyroid, liver, brain, pancreatic cancers. We know that half of all men and 1 in 3 women will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. And adding to this alarm, the incidence of childhood cancers associated with environmental factors is also rising. And so what I want to say is, as a breast cancer organization, we recognize that many of these cancers and health harms are interconnected, and what's good for breast cancer is good for our whole bodies. 27 years ago, our founders wanted to know why they got breast cancer, and they wanted to be sure that their daughters and granddaughters wouldn't get the disease. And so, we were founded in 1990, and in those early 1990s, we were one of the first breast cancer organizations, along with Toxic Links Coalition, which Judy Brady founded and worked actively in, to point to the environmental links to the disease and to work to end the epidemic by focusing on eliminating involuntary exposure to chemicals that increase the risk of breast cancer. Again, folks, when they talk to me about a breast cancer diagnosis, will often say, and with surprise, and there was no family history, but in fact, family history and genetics account for only about 1 in 10 breast cancers. And we can't explain more than half of all breast cancers, looking at the traditional factors of lifestyle. So as a social justice organization, our focus is not on telling people, what to buy or not buy, not on lifestyle tips, but really on the regulatory protections that ensure that no one is exposed to harmful chemicals, regardless of how much they know or what they can afford. And when it comes to fracking and dangerous drilling, too many communities have already been harmed. We have a moral obligation to address this growing threat to public health and prevent future harm now. Next slide. We know that fracking and dangerous drilling is a threat to the climate and to our bodies. Sandra reviewed the chemicals that are used and took us through a lot of information and these chemicals links to health harms. She pointed out that benzene is a known breast carcinogen. I want to add that it's linked to male breast cancer, and it has been found at high levels in the bodies of workers on oil fields. There is no safe level of benzene exposure. So despite the evidence of harm, from these environmental exposures and toxic chemicals, the mainstream breast cancer movement continues to focus on awareness. We know awareness cannot and has not reduced diagnoses and death from breast cancer. So we need action. Up to a third of all breast cancers, even those caught early, go on to metastasize. That is, they spread beyond the breast to other vital organs, and that's what kills women. No matter how long someone lives after a breast cancer diagnosis, and I hope it's a very, very long time, there is a lasting toll that diagnosis and treatment takes on every woman's body, psyche, and of course, finances. We do have a moral obligation to prevent cancer and put public health before corporate profit. And when it comes to the concerns about using oil wastewater to irrigate agriculture, now we have an opportunity to prevent further exposures by ending this practice. Our story, next slide please, our story from the beginning has been a story of women coming together to achieve unlikely change far bigger than what any one person could do on her own. So now is the time that I'm asking you to join us in demanding that major industries and our elected leaders protect the health of communities affected now and take action to prevent further exposure and threat to future generations. As Sandra said, we are part of the Protect California Foods Coalition with a bunch of local and national organizations that work in a variety of ways together to address this issue of wastewater. This is, of course, not the only pathway of exposure. It's an important pathway of exposure. It's part of a broad strategy to protect public health and prevent fracking and dangerous drilling. So here's some of the organizations, including Rootskeeper, which Sandra gave a shout out to, and I'm pleased that in a moment I'm going to tell you how you can get involved and do a training with Rootskeeper. We have 3 ways. So these organizations have done tremendous work, and I encourage you to get involved and support them. And there are 3 ways that we are asking you to take action today. We recently launched our legislative action toolkit, Activism for All. It's a bunch of resources about how you can make your voice heard on this and other vital breast cancer issues. So please download the toolkit, reach out to us. We want to work with you and make sure that you have what you need to really make your voice heard. And then we have a petition that we're doing in coordination with Food and Water Watch to demand that Wonderful Company and Grimway Farms stop using oil wastewater. As Kate noted at the beginning, we did last year's Think Before You Pink campaign. Toxic is a tasty, targeted Wonderful Company, and Be Sweet. And so Food and Water Watch's current action is really a continuation of that. I hope that you will sign the petition. And now I'm really happy to turn it over to David with Rootskeeper. David Braun is here to talk with us about the training. He's just an incredible activist and organizer. He's, along with Sandra, has had such a positive impact and really helped to make some important changes. I hope that all of you will attend the training next month. David, I'm turning it over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Karuna. It's really an honor to be here, and just want to make sure, can you hear me okay?
We do.
All right, very good. So also just want to take a moment and really appreciate the work that Breast Cancer Action does. Really making those connections between the chemicals in the environment and the environmental causes of what is causing cancer is just so critical, and you are kind of a lone voice out there in this forest of compromised voices that you are speaking truth to power, and I'm just so grateful for the work you do. And I know it's not easy being one of the few in that field doing that, but I'm just so grateful for what you do and the way in which you call attention. So 3 cheers for Breast Cancer Action. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you everyone for joining and taking time and the interest to find out more about this, what's going on with our food in the state of California, of course, which is being sold on a national and international market. So really this issue affects everyone in the general population to some degree. We basically tried to introduce legislation around this issue this past year. Colleagues of ours at the Center for Biological Diversity had worked on a bill, could not actually identify a legislator in the state of California who would actually sponsor this bill. And it was very common sense legislation that was actually directly in line with the recommendations of the California Council on Science and Technology. And when we could not find a sponsor for this very common sense legislation that was in agreement with what the scientists had recommended, we started realizing just to what extent the oil industry's money has infiltrated our legislators. Just in the past year, in the 2015-2016 legislative session, the oil industry spent $36 million lobbying our elected officials. And so what we started finding out is that they really weren't listening to the science, and that when you have lobbyists in your office day in and day out, it's absolutely critical that we make an appearance, that we show up, and that we actually have conversations to talk about the science. Because yes, the state of California performed this science, but those scientists that performed those studies do the science, and then it's up to us as citizens who are interested in protecting our public health to take the next step and actually bring this to the attention of our legislators. And with all of that money walking into their offices, that oil money walking into their offices day in and day out, it's absolutely critical that we be a voice to oppose that and actually represent the science. So enter in what we're doing. So we are holding trainings, and we're doing our kickoff training on how to meet and have an effective meeting with your elected official on September 26th, which goes from 7 to 8:30 p.m. It will be a live stream and webinar, and we'd love to have folks join. What we'll be doing is we'll be basically giving you the tools that you need to either combine with a group of folks that we can help put you together with to go in and meet with your elected officials, or actually have you take leadership in helping to put together a group to go in and meet with your elected officials around these issues that Sandra and Karuna have been speaking about and Kate have been speaking about. So we'd love to have you join. For more information, we encourage you to visit our website, and what we're talking about is oilmoneyout.com. Again, if you want to see that fact sheet in more depth and detail that Sandra shared earlier, that's on our resources page there on the website. And then if you want to attend the training, just go to bit.ly, and that's bit.ly/OMO, which is Oil Money Out, but OMO training. Go ahead and just sign up there, and we'll send you more information. If you have any questions about what we're talking about or doing, you can send an email to info@oilmoneyout.com, and we can follow up with you. But we will continue with this, and really look forward to participating. Again, the scientists are not in there meeting with our legislators, so it's really important that we get there with the science and present it as it's been presented to us. The oil industry has sadly, they're externalizing some costs of doing business that end up getting put onto the general public in pretty toxic ways. And the only way that will stop is with our participation. So hope to see you guys at the training or online, and join with you in this big movement. So thank you so much, Karuna, Sandra, and Kate, for involving us in this. We appreciate it. You're wonderful partners.
Great, and thank you, David, for being on this webinar. We really strongly encourage everyone to get involved, get out there, and make their voices heard on this topic. So I wanted to reiterate that if you have registered for our webinar, which obviously everyone on has, you will be receiving the recorded presentation in addition to slides within a week. So I know we've gotten a few questions about, oh, what was that link? It will all be sent out afterwards, so not to worry. And on this slide, you can see some of the additional resources that our panelists have mentioned throughout the webinar. So I specifically want to draw attention to this bottom resource, which is the compendium on the risks of fracking that both Sandra and Karuna did mention a few times. So before we get to questions, I really quickly want to go through just some additional ways to get involved. So you can become a member by signing up for our news and action alert emails to keep you up to date on the issues. We encourage you to find us on Facebook, like us. We had a Facebook event that Sandra very kindly shared on her Facebook as well. Follow us on Twitter. You can donate by going to bcaction.org/donate. And as always, just keep spreading the word to family, friends, and colleagues. Talk about these issues to make your voice heard and alert others to what's happening in our state and country. So really quickly, like I mentioned before, Breast Cancer Action relies on individual donors and support from people like you to make these webinars possible. So if you've been inspired today, if you've learned something new or deepened your knowledge or want to take action now, please consider making a donation of $25 or more so we can continue to provide educational programs like this. Again, the link for that is www.bcaction.org/donate. I also want to give a big thank you to Dr. Steingraber for her presentation today. And with that, I will be opening it up for questions. So a reminder to folks that you can ask questions in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We do have participants muted, but if you type your question into that box, we'll be able to see it on this end. So I'm going to start with a question from Sharon Barrett, which is for either of our panelists. Given the amount of water required for fracking, are there projections concerning the future of available clean water? In addition, is there any work on attempting to clean the oil wastewater? It's my understanding that this wastewater cannot be cleaned.
I can give it a try.
Sure.
So, again, yes, fracking happens in California, but the problem with contaminated water from oil drilling in California is not really, what's really driving it is not fracking per se, but the fact that the oil that comes out of the ground is mixed in with so much water. It's a kind of curse for California, I think, that you're so short on water, and yet what groundwater you do have in a large part is mixed in with the oil that's also in these shallow oil basins. And that's right, when you bring it up, it's very difficult to separate out and get clean, drinkable water when it's been mixed in with oils. In order to get salts out, in order to get heavy metals out, in order to get lightweight, volatile, organic molecules out of water requires reverse osmosis and all kinds of things that is very energy intensive and rely a lot on burning carbon, and is just not doesn't make economic sense, besides not creating public health problems. So the disposal of all of this contaminated water remains an unresolved question, and there are two. The problem that we're focused on today is that there are two places where this can end up getting stored. You can actually call it irrigation water, put it in a pipe and send it out to the fields, mixed in with other sources of irrigating water, or you can pump it back down under the ground, where it raises the risk of contaminating groundwater, which people can then either drink, or it can be brought back up to the surface and used to irrigate crops. And this is a brutal, primitive technology, and we don't have any solutions for it. In other words, you can't take water from the oil industry, whether it's fracking wastewater or water from drilling operations where they're not fracking per se, but they're doing other enhanced techniques, and end up with pure drinkable water at the end of it. There's no technology that we know that can do that.
Thank you for that really thorough answer. So we have another question from JD Hansen. I apologize if I mispronounced that name, what is the level of naturally occurring arsenic and mercury that's released by the fracking process?
We don't have answers for that either, because the answer depends on the bedrock in which you're fracking. So even in New York State, where I'm from, we know that some parts of the bedrock contain a lot more naturally occurring arsenic and mercury. And so if you happen to drill in that area, you're going to get a lot. Whereas, a few kilometers over, maybe not so much. And again, these bedrocks that are full of fossil fuels, they represent the ocean floors of ancient oceans, and the bubbles of oil and natural gas that are trapped in these layers represent the corpses of ancient sea creatures, 400 million years old, that were trapped in the silt that was then fossilized into this bedrock. Though that bedrock contains a whole periodic chart of elements, including things like radium, arsenic, mercury, and all these so-called heavy metals, and that's because they represent molecules that are eroded off of mountain ranges and eroded into this, and with the silt were deposited. Depending on the currents of these ancient oceans and the troughs, some of these heavy metals that are so toxic were more concentrated in some places, and they're not so concentrated in other places. And we don't know, when we bring oil up from the ground, what the arsenic, mercury, and other heavy metal concentrations are in that particular place, and we don't know how much is in the wastewater. So, but what we do know is that heavy metals, including arsenic, are toxic, and as long as they are trapped deep in geological strata, far from the sunlit surface where we live, they're not hurting anybody. But when you start fracking and drilling and bringing fossil fuels out of the ground, you release a whole periodic chart of elements that used to be trapped under our feet are now up in the surface. They're part of our water supply. Arsenic in particular is water soluble. They get into our crops, and they raise unknown risks for health. And this is why I think it's so important that organizations like Breast Cancer Action are speaking out about it.
Thank you. So I recognize that we're getting close to 11. I think we'll have time for just 2 more questions. So this one comes from Joyce, and I think maybe Karuna, you would be the person to answer this. But, we hear a lot about buying organic. So Joyce asks, does buying organic protect me from companies that are watering their crops with oil wastewater?
It's a great question, and the problem is that organic certification doesn't include this question of whether wastewater is being used. We know a lot of farmers, there's different ways that farmers can get water. They can, if they're lucky enough to have water rights in California and have their own well, they, may be able to have water from their land. But many farmers have to buy from local water districts, and that means that they're limited in their choices. In California, as we discussed at the beginning, you've got big ag and big oil, and they're in fundamental conflict. And so one of the things that we've been doing is asking big ag to use their power to demand clean water, so that which means, working with the water districts to insist that this process isn't used, as well as working with the governor. There's multiple strategies. But the end result will be that all, those smaller organic farmers who may not have the power themselves will also be assured that they have clean water for their fields. Right now, buying organic is not an assurance that oil wastewater isn't part of the process.
Thank you, Karuna. So our final question that relates to that, and I will leave it up to our panelists who wants to answer it, but Lawrence Abbott asks, how can we find the growing regions, perhaps zip codes of agricultural areas that are using this bad water? And similarly, how can we find the agricultural companies that are doing this? And is there a benefit to boycotting now?
I think David Braun would be the ideal person to answer that question if David is still on the line. Rootskeeper has been a real leader in watchdogging where the ag areas are that are buying and using irrigation. And I can't cite chapter and verse on that. kerning.
So if you can you hear me, Sandra?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So what I can say is I don't actually have, I know it's going on in 4 different water districts with plans to expand to others. It's going on, I don't actually have all the names in front of me. I do know the 2 that are off the top of my head are the North Kern Water District and the Coella Water District, both that are located in Kern County. And what I can tell you also for sure is that the process of utilizing this wastewater only separates the wastewater from the oil. So they'll run it through walnut husks to separate the water from the oil. They will heat it up so that the oil will rise to the top, and then they'll skim it off. But then after that, there's no, as Sandra was talking about, reverse osmosis. There is no filtration. That water then goes directly to the water district, down a pipe where it's mixed with other water that water district is using, and then sold directly to the farmers. So there's no filtration, but those are the 4 districts. Those are the 2 districts out of the 4. And Lawrence, since I know you, I can come up with those other 2 names after the webinar.
Hey, great. Thank you so much, David. So with that, we are drawing to a close of our webinar. Thank you so much for your questions and comments. Thank you again to Dr. Steingraber and David for participating. If we didn't answer your question today, or you think of one later you'd like to ask, or you have any feedback or comments whatsoever, please feel free to follow up with us at info@bcaction.org. Again, that's info@bcaction.org. And again, just thank you so much for your time and attention today. And a reminder to please keep an eye on your email for a short survey where you can provide feedback on this webinar to help make this program more beneficial, more helpful for everyone. Thank you again to our presenters, and this webinar will be recorded with slides sent out within the week. So thank you to all of the members who attended, participated, asked questions, and we hope you have a great day.